historical evidence that was released in subsequent decades. Let's move along but we're going to keep our focus on the president's dealings with China. Here's a conversation from a month later, June 4, 1973, blessedly on the White House telephone system, which is a lot easier to hear, with Henry Kissinger once again, and they're discussing the fact that Chairman Mao had invited President Nixon to make a second visit to China. Let's listen.
With regard to Mao, that is quite significant, don't you think?
I think that's of enormous significance, Mr. President.
The other thing I was going to say, though, that
because it means that they think they're going to deal with you for the foreseeable future.
The other thing is, do you think that we should get in? Well, we can't do it before you leave, but if you could get a message to the ambassador here that we think it's very important for Xi Enlai to come to the UN, or do you want to wait till August?
Or I've done that, Mr. President.
You have.
I did that. I took liberty doing that in response.
Yeah, you see, it's going to look rather strange if I go running to China if he doesn't come here.
No, I've already done that.
How'd you do it?
I said I had already extended an invitation at your suggestion a few months ago.
Yeah, I know, but
I repeated it, and I said we can do it in one of two ways: either to go to the UN, or better yet, just come to Washington on a
What I found interesting about that discussion, Luke Nichter, historian of the Nixon tapes from Texas A&M University, joining us from Austin, was where Henry Kissinger tells the president that Chairman Mao's invitation for Nixon to visit China a second time shows that they intend to deal with Nixon for the foreseeable future. That's almost a kind of a reassurance that Kissinger was trying to give the president that he's going to survive Watergate.
You wouldn't think that most presidents need quite that much bucking up, which is certainly one of the themes from this release. It's important, I think, for listeners and viewers you really have to put yourself in that 1973 mindset, not in a 2013 mindset. Nixon hasn't resigned. Watergate is kind of just beginning to accelerate. And Nixon and Kissinger are clearly planning on what are we going to do this year, what are we going to do next year with the Chinese or the Russians. And they're really mapping out the next 3.5 years confidently. Meanwhile, kind of privately, because these tapes were private, Nixon obviously needed some reassurance to keep going.
On April 30 of 1973, Nixon, again, as I had mentioned, had forced and accepted the resignations of his two closest White House aides, Haldeman and Ehrlichman. He had prayed that he would die during the night before having to do that at Camp David. He understood, I think, that his presidency had essentially ground to a halt, and that the rest was simply an end game in which he would fight to eventually to try to keep control of his tapes and lose. And so it's kind of remarkable that despite all that, here he is talking to David Bruce, talking to Henry Kissinger, carrying on the day-to-day affairs of the presidency, and with his particular interest in foreign affairs. Let's move on to a really special tape recording, which you were among the first to understand the importance of and flag for the rest of us, Luke. This is the only known recording in American history of a U.S.-USSR summit. This features President Nixon in the Oval Office talking with the Soviet General Secretary, basically the head honcho of the Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev, along with the only other man present, the interpreter, Viktor Sukhodrev, on June 18, 1973. Let's listen.
It's essential that those two nations, where possible, work together. And the key really is in the relationship between Mr. Brezhnev and myself. If we decide to work together, we can change the world. That's my attitude as we have these talks. I got some other answers. No, it's all right.
So there you have the head of the Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev, reassuring President Nixon, again at a time where his political troubles are mounting over Watergate, that the senators, the American senators that Brezhnev had spoken to, weren't needling him. Luke Nichter.
And again, you know, using our 1973 frame of reference and not 2013, I mean, now we have a whole generation of young Americans who, the Cold War is ancient history. They have no living memory of this conflict, this 40-year, 50-year conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And in this conversation, you've got the two most important leaders in the world, the President of the United States. You have the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, the only two leaders in the world capable of destroying the world. And they're, first of all, they're talking. They're getting along. They're talking. They're negotiating. And you're right. This recording, which was released last week, there's no other record. There, as you can hear in the conversation, I mean, there are no note takers. There are no aides present. So when this recording was released last week, you know, showing Nixon and Brezhnev kind of choreographing Brezhnev's upcoming week-long summit, this was the first time that we have a record of this conversation. And there's not going to be another one like this. It's fascinating.
Give me 15 to 20 seconds on this so we can fit in our final tape recording, Luke. Conservatives today look back on this kind of thawing of U.S.-USSR relations over which President Nixon and Henry Kissinger presided, so-called détente, as a kind of a dark period. And they prefer to celebrate Ronald Reagan for taking a more aggressive posture aimed at collapsing the Soviet Union. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that is true. That's kind of been the arc of history. But I think, you know, as records like these become available, Nixon knew at the time, and it's still true in many ways today. Nixon at the time was criticized by those on the right and on the left for what he did. I mean, he took a lot of risk in these initiatives to China and the Soviet Union because he had no constituency any longer. And what these records show, and as more records become available, I think what we're seeing that in all likelihood, the Reagan era was not possible without the Nixon era. And what these records show is an enormous foundation, a deep foundation that was laid in terms of U.S.-Soviet dialogue and with the Chinese that was necessary for the Reagan era.
Speaking of Ronald Reagan, our final Nixon tape we're going to play today is a telephone conversation between President Nixon and then California Governor Ronald Reagan. This was recorded April 30, 1973, after Nixon had fired or accepted the resignations of his top aides and made a lengthy televised speech on Watergate. And this was recorded at around 10:45 p.m. at night on that evening. Let's listen.
For whatever it's worth, I'm still behind. You can count on us. We're still behind you out here, and I wanted you to know that you're in our prayers.
How nice of you to say that. Well, let me tell you this, that we can be, each of us has a different religion, you know?
Yeah.
But God damn it, Ron, we have got to build peace in the world, and that's what I'm working on, and you're going to work on it, and all the rest. Just want you to know I so appreciate your calling, and give my greatest love to Nancy.
Well,
How'd you ever marry such a pretty girl? My God!
well, just unlucky.
You're lucky. That's right. As I was lucky.
Yes. Yes, you were.
How nice of you to call.
Well, we just...
You thought it was the right speech, did you?
I did. Very much so. Yes.
Just based on the sound of his voice, it's my suspicion, which we will never probably confirm, that President Nixon might have had a couple of cocktails before that call. Luke?
Yeah, he was clearly not himself in this conversation. He had just made the most difficult decision of his presidency. He let go of Haldeman, Ehrlichman. He told David Frost later that was like losing your sons, cutting off your right arm and cutting off your left arm. So he was not himself, and not just Reagan, but numerous other officials called Nixon that night to kind of buck him up, keep going. Kind of a similar tone of the earlier conversation with Henry Kissinger.
Luke Nichter, Associate Professor of History at Texas A&M University, is presently co-editing with the prestigious historian Douglas Brinkley a new volume on the Nixon tapes. When will that be out?
It is a lot of work, and the release of last week gives me even more work to do. But we are aiming for August 9th, 2014, so that'd be the 40th anniversary of Richard Nixon's resignation.
Douglas Brinkley, a past guest here on the Foxhole as well. Luke Nichter, thanks so much for taking the time to ride over to Austin and to dissect some of these fascinating recordings with us. Also, folks, if you want to read more about this, you can check out the FoxNews.com website or FoxNewsPolitics.com, and you can see my article about these tapes that we've just played with Luke Nichter. Thanks so much for visiting us here in the Foxhole. I'm James Rosen from Washington. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.